Greetings, friends, and welcome to Contemplative Light. In our world, we have a fantastic guest today. And before we get to him and all the profound things he has to offer us, I wanted to mention that I do have a book, Preparation for Great Light, that's available on Amazon, and it details 6 months I spent living in a silent monastery in the exact process of awakening that I went through in that monastery. So check it out, Preparation for Great Light on Amazon by Clint Sabom. I'm your host, Clint Sabom, if I didn't say that before. But anyways, check that out. There'll also be a link in the show notes below to it. So let's get to it. Our guest today is Dr. Mark Forman, and Dr. Mark Forman is a licensed clinical psychologist who has worked with individuals, couples, children, and families over the past 25 years. Mark is a longtime member of Ken Wilber's Integral Community, and he wrote his first book on the application of integral ideas in psychotherapy. More recently, he wrote a book reimagining Joseph Campbell's hero's journey for those with early childhood trauma called The Monster's Journey from Trauma to Connection. And Mark has been a practitioner of Kundalini Yoga for the past 30 years and hosts a bi-weekly satsang on the relationship between trauma and spirituality. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Mark Forman to our show.
Thank you, Clint, for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yes, it's my pleasure to interview you as well. And I guess I wanted to start with maybe some of the work you've done with spiritual awakening and also dealing with childhood abuse or some form of complex PTSD and how that kind of works out and maybe the best way to address it.
Sure. So putting aside the trauma aspect, at least for a moment, I went into a pretty significant depression when I was about 16 or 17 years old. And at that time, my mother, who is a psychiatrist, had been exploring meditation for herself, um, by and large. And she had found a meditation community that she really liked and had spent maybe the last year going back and forth to their programs and so on. And when I became depressed, there was discussion of putting me on medication, which happened for a little while, but these were the older medications, the ones that came before Prozac and Paxil and Zoloft, etc. And the side effects were really pretty nasty, and I just didn't stay on them for very long at all. But I didn't really have a plan B. I didn't want to do therapy at that point. Um, and so my mother said to me, would you like to come with me to this meditation thing? And much more out of, I have nothing to lose, and why not try it? I said yes. I was certainly not a spiritual kid in any obvious way, or non-obvious way for that matter. No spiritual experiences, that kind of thing. But I went to one evening program and had something of a minor breakthrough, a kind of sort of mild spiritual experience, which was really pretty earth-shattering to me because I didn't have any frame of reference for it and nothing to compare it to. And so during that first year, I kept going back again and again to all the programs I could attend. And that culminated when I was about 18 in a pretty significant Kundalini awakening, which I'm hoping or guessing your audience is familiar with, and I could talk about it if not.
Sure.
And that really set me on the path, because once that awakening happened, at least in my mind, I was now really committed uh, to having this be a big part of my life. Exactly how big was an open question. Um, but I would say that was the beginning of my path of awakening. But I still was depressed, and I would remain depressed for quite some time, the better part of a decade. And the notion of trauma, childhood trauma, complex PTSD really didn't dawn on me until my probably my mid 30s. And it's was a strange act of denial, probably, that I didn't come across it and identify it, but eventually I did. And then, what would I say, life really reinforced it for me. And I went into trauma therapy, and that, you know, second to my spiritual practice, that had the biggest impact on how I saw myself. Meaning that to identify as someone who had been a trauma survivor really changed how I saw myself, how I was now committed to recovering. And so for about the last 15 years, I've been doing both. I've been committed to recovering in my trauma journey, and still committed to my journey to awakening. Uh, and so I've had a lot of time to compare the two, and a lot of time to reflect on the time before I understood trauma and what was happening then. And my basic conclusion, and this is where I might ruffle feathers, is that these are very two different things, or two very different things. A lot of people now address these two aspects, but treat them like they are somehow really related. And my experience is that they are really not related.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. They're two distinct things, unrelated. I'm wondering about the term that Ken Wilber uses as spiritual emergency, where he talks about more state, less structure. And I
Mhm.
say this because my path, and this is one of the reasons I was so fascinated with having you on, is my path is very similar in that I had a Kundalini awakening experience when I was 21, but it really happened before I was ready. And it surfaced so much trauma that the kind of unconscious coming to the conscious mind, the trauma just kind of made that Kundalini experience, the Kundalini experience almost made it worse.
Yeah. So I would say that is one place where there is some overlap. So if you have a big spiritual awakening, Kundalini, or even if you describe it otherwise, or someone describes it otherwise, that can kick up traumatic material. But what I mean when I say they're very different is that, okay, let's say you pursue the path of meditation and Kundalini, and let's say you traverse that path very far. Um, that is not in any necessary way going to impact your trauma. That's the issue. You can have really, and I mean this with respect and admiration, you can really develop an expansive spiritual perspective and outlook, but the if untreated, the trauma is going to lurk, you could say, in a corner or in a compartment or out of sight. I often think of sort of it as a just an analogy. It's like the Kundalini or the awakening is like a shaft of light that goes through your being, but the trauma is off in a corner that does not receive that light in any very direct way. And it's hard, I think, for people who've committed to the path of awakening to really grasp that, because it feels so full when you're in one of these powerful states, or even if you've transitioned to something that feels more steady and is not necessarily a state. It can feel like you've addressed the darkness in you, so to speak. But that's part of the power of trauma, is its ability to hide. And therefore, this is my explanation for why so many spiritual teachers who seem to carry such awakening also go through periods where they seem to lose their equanimity and balance and get caught in troublesome situations, do bad things, particularly in relational contexts. And there is a connection between early trauma and relationships that's really pretty central. So, even the people I or you or someone else might look up to as a master of the spiritual seem to be susceptible. And that's part of my evidence for why I say the spiritual expansion process will not get to trauma. So hence, we have to do something else. And you could just broadly call that trauma recovery. And one of the things, as I began to think about this, was I began to go back to the Joseph Campbell's material, which was a big influence on me when I was younger. I was quite the reader of Campbell. And I was realizing, okay, the hero's journey that he describes is a good way of talking about reaching spiritual evolution, through the symbols and metaphors of story. But I don't think it's counts or the same for people who have childhood trauma. They have a different story. So I could explain one part of this that shows the difference. So in the hero's journey, the hero starts out in their village or tribe or community, and everything is usually pretty boring and humdrum. They get what they need to do, day to day, and their life is pretty mundane. And then they get a call to adventure, which is the call towards the mystical, secret parts of life. They don't know that, but that's what it is. in Campbell's mythologies. But the the person with childhood trauma never has this period of normalcy where everything is just okay, I'm getting along in my world. Their first period of life is painful, is frightening, involves trying to fake their way through normalcy while underneath feeling deep pain. And so they don't get a call to adventure. They have a period of lost innocence, which is premature. So the hero loses his or her innocence later when they've gotten this call and now they're exposed to the wonders as well as the darkness of the world. The monster already has that happen. And if you, so to say a final thing for now, if you read a story of a monster that actually tries to tell the story, like The Hunchback of Notre Dame, or a book like White Fang by Jack London, which are books I analyze in the Monster's Journey book, you can see and track their trajectory according to a different set of stages than the hero's journey. And their journey is just as profound for them, but it's different. Now, to add one level of complexity, it may be possible to do both journeys in a weird way in your life, because the human psyche is complex and has parts. But if you don't do the monster's journey as a trauma survivor, it's always going to be extremely difficult, that unhealed trauma.
Yeah, this is fantastic stuff. It matches and resonates with my own experience. I too read a lot of Joseph Campbell growing up, and all really throughout my life going through that. And I always felt like, if you break it down into three acts, that act one in Campbell was very much more positive than I. And this is reassuring to hear, because there are times when I wonder what the call was and did I miss the call for adventure. So, it's interesting, or if I just jumped into act two immediately. So maybe if you could run through the monster's journey and how the protagonist finds his or her way through.
Yeah. So if we were doing a really a more high tech discussion, which there's no reason we have to do, but just if we had a PowerPoint and visuals, I would now be lining up the stages and comparing them in a visual way, because it's a nice way to do it. And in the book I create some charts and stuff so that people can see the stages lying next to each other. But the way that I see it is that that first stage, as I mentioned, for the person on the monster's journey of early trauma, is the loss of innocence. So that happens. That's the analogous stage to the call. Basically, you could say.
Fascinating.
They just go into a period because, and here's the reason, is that 80% roughly of trauma experience in childhood is delivered by people who the child cares about. So technically it's called interpersonal trauma. So if your mother or your father or an uncle or a grandparent does something to you that's traumatizing, or maybe they're a substance addict, or maybe they're mentally ill in a way that's very scary, all kinds of permutations. That's happening to you through someone you love and probably look up to and admire and rely on. So that feeling of losing your innocence is really fast. Now, on the hero's journey, depending on the journey you read, you've got 12 to 17 years typically, if not more, to get acclimated and to learn to trust the people around you before something really goes wrong. And then there's the call. And it might not even be that it's someone in your family that breaks your trust or something. It could be, but it could just be that something has gone dangerous in the community. There's a dragon, or there's a murder, or something like that. I often like to refer to Neo in the Matrix. Uh, he gets this little set of messages on his computer. He's living his life. He's somehow this computer coder, but he doesn't know really what he's looking for or why. He gets these series of messages on his computer and then has this strange interaction with these party goers, and that's his call. But he's an adult, and for all we know, a relatively normal adult living a relatively normal existence. We come to find out it's not when we learn what the Matrix is, but he's a good example. If somebody gets it later, Frodo in Lord of the Rings doesn't discover that he owns the ring, or Bilbo's going to give him the ring, until he's, a comparatively young hobbit. So that first period of innocence is what happens to the monster. And then they live in what I call, or refer to as, sort of being the timeless monster. And I'll explain this term monster in a second. But they go into a period where there's nothing they can remember before that was good. There's nothing that they can imagine in the future that's good, because they haven't experienced anything that's good. So they just go through this childhood period where it's very painful and they have to find a way to survive. Now, let's go back a step and talk about what I mean by monster. So the monster is not a negative, or a pejorative term, like they're a monster, they're, misshapen and scary. What I mean by the monster's journey is when those interpersonal traumas happen, what children do is they take it on themselves. They don't have the maturity to say, my father has a drug problem, and boy, he's really pretty messed up and he needs some help. And this is not, I have to deal with this, but this is not on me. I'm my own person. That's something maybe a teenager, young adult could say. A child usually is more self-centered in a weird way, and they say, because this is happening, it must somehow be my fault.
Yes.
And so they take it in and take it on themselves, and they come to believe, and this is my argument, that somehow they're the monster, they're the bad one, and they live that way for a long time. And so, in my analysis of monster stories, which is part of the book, a monster is almost, these days in modern times, monsters are almost always something that was more human, that went through a period of transformation that was negative. And our superhero stories are a lot like that. They get exposed to radiation, there's some kind of weird genetic thing. They get bit by a spider and they become these sort of figures of power, and at least initially, often of darkness. And they have to find their way out to the world, and often it happens to them when they are children, or when they're infants even. So there are stories of later transformations, but there are a lot of stories where the person is just born into the situation. So they go through this period of sort of timeless trauma where they can't imagine a future, and then they have a, a confrontation, which I call meeting the healer. And meeting the healer means the exposure to any person. Could be a romantic partner, could be a therapist, could be another family member, could be a friend, could even be a stranger in a way, who stops them and shows them, hey, you're not this ugly thing that you imagine yourself to be. There's more to you inside than you know, and there's more goodness and beauty inside you that you know. And so they have this almost type of, like, in a way, awakening experience of, oh, maybe I'm not this person or this monster I imagine myself to be. Maybe there's something underneath. And that really is the type of call to adventure now for the person on the monster's journey, in the sense of now they're on a different path because they've had a confrontation with something that's beyond what they thought they knew. And then the period then becomes trying to live in the normal world, trying to acclimate, usually with practices. So one thing that a healer doesn't just say, hey, there's more to you than you see behind this trauma. The healer often gives you wisdom and advice for how to live. And so the person on the monster's journey tries to take up that wisdom and apply it in their life. And the goal is really, can I live in the normal world with the normal emotions and doing the normal tasks that are called for me to do? So, and this is really no joke. When I work with a traumatized client, and in my own experience, holding down a job is a trial of the everyday that comes pretty easily for most people, unless the job is, somehow unusual. But for someone on the trauma path, is very hard to show up every day, be consistent, not get upset if there's drama in the workplace. This is a trial for them. Or having a relationship, a romantic relationship specifically, not that it's ever easy for people, but for the trauma survivor, they have all these big emotional triggers and reactions. And I haven't mentioned the word trigger, but that's an important part of it, is they just have that early trauma sets up all these triggers that you don't always even have to hit directly. You just have to kind of brush them, and the person can have a huge reaction. So this is a long period of challenge of trying to acclimate, and usually involves a lot of personal work, a lot of trauma recovery work. in order to get there, to acclimating to the normal world. Once the person on the monster's journey can do that, what they discover typically is that what I call the gifts of the trauma, that because they had to go through something so difficult to get where they are, they've developed some outsized gifts, like gifts of empathy or morality or of healing, or of perseverance, or of creativity. Creativity is a really common one, because they had to survive. And in order to survive, they needed to a place to grow. And what they learn to do in their recovery is give back the gifts of the trauma to the world around them. And that creates a sense of redemption for the trauma. I mean, the trauma is never something you want. You would give it back if you could. But the second best thing is to give back the gifts that you got, because it makes some meaning of the trauma. Now, some of those gifts might influence your spiritual practice. You know, you want to go deeper, you're more perseverance, or you have more perseverance, you have more empathy. And so it might motivate you. And it's true that a lot of people in spiritual communities do have trauma, and that seems to motivate them. So sometimes the spirituality comes out of that. But you give back that gift of the trauma, and then the last stage, or the last couple stages, and I consider at least one of them optional. So forgiveness is optional. Some people forgive the people who traumatize them. Some people don't. There's some advantages to forgiveness. I think if we, understand, Christian theology, that they talk about forgiveness more than probably anybody. We can see the potential power in it, but with clients, it's an individual choice. If they choose to forgive in their heart, great. And if they don't choose to forgive, they don't have to forgive. But there's a kind of threshold there. And then, that final decision is how much do they want to be in the world still after going through all these things. And that's the final uh, spot on the hero's journey as well, is do they return to the village and whatnot, or do they retreat? So the very famous story is of the Buddha, who, when he reaches enlightenment, has something like a 10-day contemplation of whether he should even try to teach what he's learned, or should he just, I would say, persist in his state of awakening. And there's something similar for people on the monster's journey. They may go back to an intentionally simplified, little more isolated life, because it's too much for them to head out there and teach what they've learned. On the other hand, there are people who have. I think of Tony Robbins, if you know his story, is,
Sure.
he survived tremendous familial trauma, and he obviously dedicated himself to passing on what he learned. So he would be a prime example of someone who's taken his trauma and used it to help, or try to help, depending on one's perspective. I quite like Tony Robbins. Some people don't.
I know
Uh,
I like them too, actually, in fact, and that comes as a surprise to most of my listeners, but I do think Tony offers a lot of great stuff.
Yeah, and it's funny when he has a documentary on Netflix, and as I was watching him, that was my first longer exposure to him. And what I liked was that I could tell he had been through trauma. He talked about it. It was a part of how he interacted with people. And I went, "Oh, this is my tribe." Whether I could ever do anything like Tony Robbins or not, but he's I recognize him as somebody who's gone on a similar journey and resonate with that. Um,
Totally.
yeah, yeah. So that's a rough kind of comparison. Obviously, in the book, I'm very careful and try to do everything step by step, and I'm making an argument about this whole other archetypal journey that I think is now in our stories and is a more modern archetype that we don't see as much in older mythologies. But this is a belief of Ken Wilber, which I align with, which is that, as we evolve collectively, we're going to have new stories. And it doesn't mean the old stories aren't important, but it just means we will also have new stories, new archetypes to try to explain things that are evolving in consciousness, you might say. And I think the trauma recovery process is something that has been evolving. All the books I chose, particularly White Fang, which is like 1906, and Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. I can't remember, but it's early 19th century at the latest. These are books that would not be written in olden times. They're very modern, very insightful as to the process of trauma, even though they don't have that word. Some of it you can take almost paragraph for paragraph as descriptions of trauma. It's really quite amazing what they did.
Yeah.
So in
Okay, go
my,
ahead.
I'm
Go.
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So in my satsang, what I call it is one life, two journeys satsang. And what we do is we talk, we meditate, we take time for spiritual contemplation. And then we talk either about spirituality or trauma or both. And my goal is to have participants have the sense of both of these things so that they have this now new way of relating. Both are very important. You can commit to both, but we need different ones at different times. And how do we recognize what we need? So a simple, very simple thing is sometimes sitting when you're traumatically triggered is not the way to go, because inside you is so much turmoil that if you're attempting to be mindful or witnessing of it, it's extremely hard. So maybe you do something a little more active, like a walking meditation, kind of distracts you a little more. Or maybe you do something relaxing, like a shavasana, lying down meditation, which kind of allows your body to release a little more emotion. Or maybe you just journal for that meditation uh, portion, because the journaling can get your feelings out. Or maybe you go watch a movie because you just need to distract yourself. And there's wisdom in that, knowing of what are the days I'm going to do to certain practices. And you certainly can work to sit with traumatized feelings, but one has to know when you're in that ready state. and you have the resilience. And in my practice, I sat all the time through traumatic states, not knowing it, and it it colored my meditation very negatively at parts because it was so difficult. And I eventually realized, okay, the instructions I'm getting for meditation, which felt like good instructions, were not covering, I wasn't seeing people go through what I would go through. Um, Certainly there were other trauma survivors in the audience, but the majority of people were, meditation is difficult, but not that difficult. Um, so there's a wisdom piece of how to practically apply this self-knowledge.
Yeah, yeah, all that resonates. And now maybe you've covered this and I kind of missed it and it went over my head. But one thing that comes to mind is traumatic memories that are blocked in the mind. Is it necessary to uncover those?
Well, what I would say is that, so there's something called an episodic memory. This is, now we're into psychology. So an episodic memory is what it sounds like. You remember this incident and it's a little movie in your head. Now, the evidence suggests, because people have been looking at this for probably about the last 20 years of modern psychology, into the maybe into the late 90s, in mid 90s, maybe, that it does not appear that we block episodic memories and that we can like hypnotize ourselves and pull them up. It appears that what happens is when you hypnotize somebody, you can suggest to them and they will create a memory. So memory is not always reliable in that way. Now, there are other forms of memory at the level of the body, what they call procedural memory. It's like the memory of how to be in the physical world. And then there's also what's called semantic memory, which is memory of rules and norms. And, how do you learn to be a little Japanese kid in Japanese society? You've got all these rules and things and language that you don't remember remembering. And semantic memories and procedural memories is where the trauma can go before we're able to get these episodic memories, which come later. So typically, if you think about it, probably your earliest episodic memories are 3, maybe 4, maybe 5, and they're very fragmented. And that has to do with the maturation of the brain. But if you have interpersonal trauma, you could have been being abused since day 0. So you store it in these other body memories, basically, you could say, and sort of belief memories that you don't know where they came from. So someone, trauma survivor, might say, I just believe that I'm a bad person and I don't know why. So those types of memories are very important to expose and to work with. If there are episodic memories that you remember, those are also possible to expose and work with, but you're not going to dig them out and then have a whole new episodic memory that you didn't have and that's likely true. What I usually tell people is if they're looking to find out information about their early trauma, it's often the family members who have that information. Like it's held in family secrets that, okay, you had an uncle who was sexually abusive and people sort of knew, but they didn't talk about it, and you were around that uncle or something, that's the place to go for that kind of information. Now, obviously, that's risky. It depends on who you ask. You have to trust the person, but that's where people often get those stories that they can trust. Um, but you have to deal with all those forms of memory in one way or another as a way to learn to not get hooked in by the trigger, uh, and then go spiraling out. That's a lot of the process of trauma recovery. Is, okay, that was a trigger. I can let it pass. It doesn't mean I'm in danger. Someone's hurting me, etc. I'm going back to that time. It's doom and gloom, etc. It's just a memory in my system that got triggered by some event. And there's a detachment there. Now, that sounds like meditative detachment, but you've got to take those skills and apply them to trauma. You're not going to just use your meditation automatically. The reason is trauma moves much faster than the body and mind typically moves. So you have to catch these traumatic triggers going at 4 times the speed of typical thoughts and emotions. And that takes practice. You need help to point those things out. Go, that was, you just got triggered. Did you see it? And normally you don't see it until someone points it out. So my main therapist would often be like, you just got triggered, and now you're talking out of the trauma. Okay, so try to get centered, try to recognize that was a memory, and like a memory of being abandoned, let's say, and try to get back to the present moment. And then let's have a little dialogue with that hurt part of you, with your wise adult in the conversation. So that's a little snapshot of some of what trauma work can be.
Well, fantastic. I mean, this is great stuff. I almost feel like I could talk to you for 3 hours, but we've gone over so much. Are there, as far as the satsangs, the books, your websites, are there any, you want to share all the resources with which people can find you?
Sure. So for the satsangs, people can just look up trauma and spirituality.net. It's all one word, .net. And that'll take you to the satsang information. So trauma and spirituality. If there were a book that I would recommend that I think is probably the most important book to read right now, it's called The Body Keeps the Score
Yeah.
by Bessel van der Kolk, who's one of the leading researchers and clinicians in early childhood trauma. And I would say you could start there. There are many types of treatments and resources. I list them in my book, The Monster's Journey, all the different things you can try. Uh, and, the book itself is a good resource for learning about trauma and thinking about spirituality and trauma. But I would even say, do The Body Keeps the Score first.
Gotcha, gotcha. And your satsangs, are they online or are they in person?
Yes, so they are online on Thursday evenings every other week, Pacific US time. I'm into starting to record them to try to put them up So if people can't make the satsangs, that they can listen to the talk and the meditation. The sharing part is confidential. Um, and it's free. Anybody's welcome. And it's the same Zoom link every time. So they just have to hop in at 5:30 p.m. Pacific on every other Thursday. I will miss this upcoming one next week due to some family obligations, but that's my commitment to do this every other week and try to grow a little bit of a community or a place where people can go to talk about these things. And
Okay, fantastic.
yeah, well, thank you, Clint. It was total pleasure to talk to you. I certainly hope your guests got some good things out of it. And as I always say, take what works and leave the rest. Um, so yes, my pleasure.
My pleasure too, and many, many blessings to you, Dr. Forman. And it was such a treat, so much valuable information here. So thank you so much.
All right, take care, Clint.